It's been a long time coming. But what's changed in recent years? A lot of things, and this has really changed the situation. Uh, the technologies have become far more mature. It's taken a long time, but they're far more mature than they were. The data is easier to access. As I mentioned, the suppliers have been providing data reporting modules. There are new visualization analytic tools that people are becoming more and more comfortable with and using. There are new suppliers that are specifically targeting the use of data and increased discussion of the use cases in industry. There's more presentations at conferences. Coincidentally, TRB created first a task force on transit data and then a full-blown committee. It became a full-blown committee. And all this coincides with a general societal discussion of big data, IoT, smart cities. So there's been more interest, I think, among transit leadership in all this. And this has led to a growing industry recognition that transit ITS data is actually a valuable resource. Many years ago, there were sort of individual agencies here and there. There were individuals that were known to be experts. But I'm seeing more and more a broader range. And the symposium last year really highlighted that with many keen interest from many transit. 1/3 of the participants were practitioners. So it's people are discussing about business intelligence, data analytics, decision support systems, open data, big data. It's characterized by volume, velocity, and variety of 3 V's. So things have been really changing in recent years. I won't go through this in great detail. This comes from a report that I wrote, but it's been tweaked over the years. And then we had a much more full discussion for those who participated in the December workshop, which I believe is still available. Am I right somewhere? But these were sort of the typology of the uses of data, systematic monitoring for sort of executive dashboards, a lot of focus on service operations planning, on-time performance, schedule adherence, there various strategic analyses, tactical analyses, exploratory data mining, and we're looking at safety aspects of the data, accessibility and equity, access to health, or sort of more recent focus, and starting to see decision support for real-time operational control, and I'll come back to that. But in parallel to this, and I guess coincidentally, a group of academics that were keenly interested in applied research and really looking at how you could use these technologies for applications in the transit industry started getting together, and I was part of this group. I was sort of the token non-academic. Starting in 2014, and they had a series of workshops that progressively first started focusing on smart card data, and then on AVL and APC data, and then on operations-based applications, and then passive data. And so it's most recent was the one in Transit Data 2020, which really focused on trying to look at not only the methodologies, not only the cool applications, but also we had good discussions about some of the challenges and the governance and the management and collaboration with universities. And that fits right into the themes that Amr talked about earlier this morning. So it was a big success, even though we had to pivot to be virtual. 250 participants, 100 speakers, 19 countries. We used a lightning presentation format and plenaries, and the proceedings and recordings and the presentations are still all available at transitdata2020.ca. But then last year happened, and this reinforced even more the importance of data. I'll give you 2 examples. Vehicle crowding. People were desperate to know, because of the fear of the virus, what was the level of vehicle crowding on vehicles. And those who didn't have any data at all couldn't provide anything. Some transit systems had APC data so that at least they could pull out historical records. Some of them put into a mode where they could actually update on a weekly or next day looking at the the data from the APCs. Very few were able to actually provide real-time data by transmitting their APC data in real time and then transforming it and then presenting it to the public. Other systems tried to develop other mechanisms. Commuter rail used weight monitoring systems. People looked at using new types of data, Wi-Fi traces, and some, you know, for lack of anything, used crowdsourced data. And the other thing was a lot of systems had to recut schedules or redesign their networks on the fly very quickly. And if you didn't have the data, you really couldn't do it. So I think there's been a heightened sensitivity in the industry about the use and importance of data and analytics. So what as I see is the arc that I see, and this is sort of a gross generalization of how this is evolving or in the current situation. But basically, many agencies struggle with the initial technical challenges related to one specific application, on-time performance, or passenger loads, or ons and offs, or origins and destinations for a few. And I'll come back to that. And that took a long time for many agencies to resolve. And so as they tried to resolve these, to be able to get these applications in a form that they could use on a regular basis, this raised right away a whole series of interorganizational issues and discussions, often very painful, conflicts between different groups, you know, planning versus IT versus operations versus finance. And it really, there'd be this sort of discussion, one application after another, you know, as they tried to resolve it, the same kinds of issues do come up every time. And until there's actually, and it's very difficult how you get leadership buy-in, until leadership, general management, policy boards recognize the need to set up a new approach, a new framework, that there's value in all this, it's very difficult to resolve those organizational issues. But I'm starting to see more and more agencies where this is happening, which is really good news. And this then eventually leads to developing a business intelligence strategic plan to address all of these organizational, and there are many technical issues as well, but the organizational ones are probably the tougher ones. And eventually then enterprise deployment. And so we're just starting to see, last symposium brought to several examples of agencies that are going through this arc of how they get to a position where they can really use data for decision making. So those first technical issues I synthesized in a brief discussion paper. It's only 20 pages back in 2015. If anybody's interested, shoot me an email and I'd be glad to send it to you. But it dealt with a lot of these, and it came about through a lot of discussions and workshops and so forth. And some of the technical challenges, and you'll recognize these, there's always corporate data management challenges, but those would be resolved sort of on an ad hoc basis. But the transit data itself, the quality of the data, ensuring the quality of data was a big challenge for all agencies. ITS systems were not designed to create data. They were designed to provide enhanced security and operational control or revenue management. Most of the systems don't have very sophisticated diagnostic tools. There are a whole bunch of factors that affect the data quality as well, and many challenges in matching and cleaning the data. And then even once cleaned, there was issues about ownership of the data and lack of internal expertise and lack of support and bad day challenges. And so a lot of these are documented in the report I just mentioned. But I'll give you just a few of the technical challenges, on data quality, matching and cleaning. Geocoding of bus stops, multiple bus stop inventories and IDs, data matching between scheduling the CAD AVL system with layover locations, loops, negative loads, how you rebalance those, multiple sources of GPS location, factoring up samples, linking data to schedules and actual service, and adjusting because there's ever-changing schedules and bus stops. But now we're seeing like I said, more sophisticated discussions to resolve the organizational issues. And these stem from the fact that different groups in a transit agency have different objectives. They have different perspectives. They have different expectations. They speak different languages in some cases. And I gave an example. You can just look at that, and think data specialists versus transit planners versus the IT group versus operations versus finance. They all have different objectives, different perspectives. So it's really hard to iron those out. And obtaining buy-in from operations is often a sticking point because they're operations driven and they rely on standard operating procedures to make sure quality on a consistent basis. But getting them to use data is difficult if you don't understand how operations works and if you don't speak the same language. And there are issues about when there are data problems. I mean, who's identified by users? Whose responsibility is to fix it? How do you enable the shared use of new tools developed by users? What are the roles and organizational positions of data scientists versus business analysts versus planners? All these kinds of issues, every time you try to take one application, in many cases, you have to come up with a resolution of them. And as I mentioned, gaining policy board and senior management buy-in is probably really critical. And there's all sorts of challenges there. There's just lack of interest from management and policy boards. There's their confusion over the benefits. They don't like to deal with interdepartmental conflicts. There are issues of single source of truth. Does the writer should come from the APC or does it come from the fare collection system? Lack of focus on importance of data, which led to the whole issues about ownership of data and lack of internal resources. But I see that changing. And another challenge that comes to bear is how do you build a bridge between IT and the subject matter experts? There's no single right answer. Everybody has a different approach. But you have to provide business units with access to the data, an ability for fast processing, and space for complex queries, an ability to create tools and share with the enterprise. And it's the classic centralization versus decentralization dilemma. And how do you build that social capital over time between different departments to identify common goals and align expectations about the data, access to the data? But what I see now is people starting to say, okay, we need a comprehensive approach to this problem. So we need a strategic plan for business intelligence or data analytics, whatever you call it, which has got to resolve things like the organizational framework. Where does data reside? Who has access? And how? Development of applications and dashboards. Who's responsible for that? What are the data retention policies? Cybersecurity is increasingly important. And how do you maintain that while still providing access to different groups? And especially if you have outsiders, outside suppliers or software as a service, how do you ensure that cybersecurity? Open data policies, which are coming in sort of transversal in this whole discussion. And external data sharing, how do you develop and manage the APIs and the use of standards? And a specific issue is that as agencies become more sophisticated in their use of data and analytics, well, then you need specialists that know how to do that. And it's not easy. Depends a lot on what market you're in. I mean, I pity the poor transit agencies in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, competing against Google and so forth to get people with these kinds of skills. And the same problem occurs, here and in New York and other big cities that have a vibrant high-tech environment, because compensation is challenging. But transit's pretty attractive to a lot of people. People like to work for transit because it's a social good and stable, and it's got interesting applications using data. And there are new horizons that are out there that really can attract people with data skills. So it varies, but I think the collaboration with universities, and that's something that Amber and I are trying to stress, is we're really trying to engage the practitioner industry to work with us. And he mentioned the new course that he's developing. So that's sort of the arc of where we're getting to. And here, now I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, a bit the future, or what I see is coming, what was happening, which I think is exciting. One is changes to transit data. We're starting to move beyond just, okay, let's measure on-time performance or origin destination. We heard an interesting one this morning about bringing in socio-demographic information into that. But one of the more interesting things, I think, is the use of real-time data for decision support systems. So that means really transforming data into information, and Amber mentioned descriptive, predictive, prescriptive. So really, use real-time data for gap and bunching analysis, managing service disruptions, proactive operational control. I mean, wouldn't it be cool if the AVL systems actually recognized patterns of bunching before they occurred, and then made suggestions of how to resolve that? It's been talked about, but I'm starting to see that we're starting to have the tools to really do that. And then there's new data sources that are pretty cool. Social media, we talked about this morning, use of Wi-Fi traces, use of drones. I've even read about use of LiDAR for visual recognition. And then there's this sort of leads into the emerging use of artificial intelligence and deep learning, deep machine learning, and so forth. That was mentioned several times this morning. Academics have been focusing on that, but I'm starting to see it in the in actual transit agencies, occasionally using it for various applications. And UITP did a study and sort of found 4 areas that where they thought there were many applications of AI: customer excellence, operational excellence, engineering excellence, and asset management, safety and security management. I point out asset management because that's probably been one of the neglected areas, but a very, very important one. And the US DOT program has a program called AI for ITS, where they did a big survey of all applications of ITS and came up with 7 that were specifically transit related. So I see that whole area starting to emerge, but of course it all has to build on what I said before. If you don't have a framework, you can't do this, or it's very, very hard to do it. And one of the things I'm very happy about is to finally see more and more focus on specifications, more standardized approaches. So this started with GTFS, of course. There were efforts before. It was something called TCIP, but it never really got off the ground. But GTFS was extremely successful, and there's a group called mobilitydata.org that are sort of trying to extend the GTFS family, as I call it. They're looking at GTFS best practices. They're now calling GTFS schedule, because there's so many other relatives in this family. GTFS real time, people know about. There's a GTFS Flex version 2 now. There was also not developed by, not under the sort of family that mobility data is involved in, but the University of Oregon developed for the state of Oregon GTFS Ride, which focuses on ridership data. And then there's an explosion of transit specifications and frameworks that are under development, or recently developed or under development. Open Trip Planner was mentioned this morning. There's a recent TCRP report, which is focusing specifically on demand responsive transactional data specification, and that's actually being applied in tested in a few areas right now. I'm on the team for TCRP G18, which formally sort of emerged out of the TIDES effort by John Levin at Metro Transit, which is trying to develop a data management framework which would allow for the sharing of data or sharing of reports, so that, applications, so that, right now, if you see something cool, you get a PowerPoint, and that's, a PDF of a PowerPoint. This would actually allow for much more exchange between transit agencies or between academics and transit agencies. There's a new specification I just recently found out about called General On-Demand Feed Specification, GOFS, which is rider-facing transactional, trying to deal with sort of the ride sourcing a lot. And There's a GTFS performance that's being proposed. US DOT has a whole huge website of ITS transit standards training modules. And then those are sort of on the GTFS, AVL, APC area, but there's multiple ones being talked about for multimodal, integrated multimodal payment. There are various specifications there. California has a really interesting project called CAL ITP, which is trying to tie together standardized contactless payment with customer discounts with trip planning information. And Europe has multiple efforts as well under the transmodal umbrella and so forth. So that sort of leads me to external landscapes. So a parallel effort is going on with mobility specifications, because there's been all these interests because of the explosion of new forms of mobility. The bike sharing, the microtransit, the car sharing, the ride hailing, and so forth. So there's GBFS, which is a bike share specification. There's something that the Open Mobility Foundation and developed, and NACTO is sort of sponsoring, which is a mobility data specification, which is really trying to get a handle on all these new modes, and so that municipalities can really figure out what is going on and develop the right appropriate policies and tactics related to that. SAE has gotten into this as well, and they're developing a standard which would be a taxonomy and definitions of terms for ride sharing and related enabling technologies. And a lot of this is all moving towards mobility as a service, as sort of a bit of the vision that many people have, many experts, transit agencies. There's a definition from my friend Carol Schweiger about mobility as a service. So it's not just an app, it's a framework that ties together all the modes and uses a platform to link traveler information, trip planning, booking, integrated payment through different formats, pay-as-you-go or subscription bundles. And as you're probably aware, there are numerous private or public platforms being proposed, developed, tested, and a few are being deployed. Integrated multimodal control centers. It's been talked about in the past, but we're now, with the power of the technologies and the sensors, there had been concepts in the past called integrated corridor management, which was tested in two areas in the US, and it's been proposed in others, including Montreal. But transportation management centers, I grabbed this image from a presentation by a Chinese general manager of a transit system in China, but you can sort of see we can bring together sensor data with AVL or AFC data or whatever to give complete real-time information. And I think we're going to start seeing this more and more across, in the world. In other mobility transportation perspectives, location-based services is a whole new realm of data collection for all modes. And curbside management is also, the MDS is partially motivated because of the complexity and the growing complexity of curbside management and the many conflicts that have to be resolved, between parking, bus lanes, bike lanes. Those were already existing, but now we have all the food deliveries and package deliveries and possibly robots and possibly drones. And this is going to make for a very crowded set of sidewalks. And two things I found out recently. I mean, scaleai.ca, this is a process that framework, a collaborative effort that Transport Canada is involved in to actually explore extensively the use of AI in things like port access management or rail freight management. And there's a Canadian Center on Transportation Data, which is mostly static information, but again, it's sort of highlighting the importance of data. And this leads up to the big kahuna, which is the connected and automated vehicles. The amount of data that will be generated and processed. And they're using the term cooperative driving automation. One of the programs in the US DOT called Karma is totally redefining TSP and how it would work using connected vehicle data. There are efforts to try to understand how the data would be managed and how it would be used. The US DOT has a data access and exchange research area with different data hubs. But transit is really barely visible in any of these efforts. And we really don't know how it fits in. So I'm just sort of planting a seed that these are things to think about, because this is a world that is coming. And to finish up, there are other emerging landscapes that are also going to be, they're data intensive and data driven, and going to be really will require much more sophisticated frameworks. So we're talking about smart cities and open municipal data portals and dashboards, where there's going to be data access and data fusion challenges and issues, digital twins, next generation urban modeling tools, municipal innovation hubs. And again, where does transit in all this, and how does it fit in? We're slowly moving to resolve the internal issues, although there's always a lag between the leaders and the rest of the industry. But I think I just wanted to plant the seed that there's a bigger world out there that we should start thinking about. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Like I said, the symposium presentations and recordings are available for a small fee at transitdata2020.ca. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Brendon. It's definitely eye-opening, but it can actually be a little bit overwhelming when we really look at what's going on, not just within the realms of public transit, but also outside the emerging landscapes that you talked about. Sometimes you actually scratch your head and you think, where do I fit exactly within this whole world and emerging challenges and frameworks? So it's very interesting, but overwhelming, as I said. We have one question in the chat box by Willem. So yeah, the question goes, you've mentioned leadership buy-in several times throughout the presentation. I'm wondering what kinds of models for buy-in you've seen that work.
Yeah, this is a key question. I may be exaggerating, but my personal perception is that transit leadership, general management, policy boards are not naturally inclined to be very interested or big intensive users of data, and really don't understand technology in most cases. So it's a real challenge, because of course you don't get the resources unless the people at the top think there's a value to getting the resources and the tools. To getting the tools are one thing, but getting the people is even harder, because those, adding FTEs is difficult, and these are very expensive people to hire in general. So I've always advocated that there should be more focus on use cases, and it's up to, it's sort of the middle management staff have to come up with with the use cases that are convincing. And I think it's moved much more. It's been much easier in recent years, because the visualization tools are very powerful, and those visualization tools allow to tell, in visual terms, the messages of what the data shows. So that helps, but I think there's a real role for consultants, and especially suppliers. And they hadn't been really doing that for many years. I would say, don't go to a conference and just say how great your tool is. Find a transit practitioner, a transit agency that actually used your tool, and get them to tell it, because that would then convince their peers that there's something worthwhile there. But that's changing too. I've been noticing far more white papers developed by suppliers and webinars. I think actually the last year of COVID really force people to find new ways to get their messages across. So that you know, that really does help, and I think that has helped to get the message across. And then I think things like I said in COVID, you know, where if you were a transit agency without any data, there wasn't much you could do. But you could see that some of your some of your peer agencies that did have data could do much more interesting things with it and convey much more powerful messages to their customers. So I think it's slowly happening. I think academics have a role to play too, and I think, you know, you and I, we're sensitive to this, and we're trying to engage the practitioner community. Most academics don't. I mean, they just write papers for academic journals that nobody has access to and nobody reads, except for other academics. So it's a combination thing. There's no silver bullet, but it's a number of things. I think Willem asked a follow-up or something. Oh, yes, that's all right. Well, as I said, there's a role for academics too, but they have to be willing and interested. And the problem is they get no brownie points for that, really. In the academic system, you get brownie points for publishing in, you know, in Transportation Research Part A or whatever. You don't get any brownie points for engaging and having a useful dialogue with transit agencies or with suppliers. It's not none, but far less. And so you really have to make an effort to do so. So it's been really cool to be part of TAL as it's launched, because it's really trying to do that. And there have been very, very few universities around the world that have really managed to do this.
To this point, Brendon, I just wanted to ask you the following question. You've been in a very interesting position where you have one foot in the industry and one foot in academia. You've you're very familiar with both worlds, and you also you are very familiar with many settings outside the Toronto, like in the US, and collaborations between academia and industry. So historically, the transit industry hasn't really been, how should I put it, hasn't really been collaborating quite closely with the academia. This is changing now. Can you give us like some good examples from your experience and your exposure to collaborations in other places, the US or other places?
Yeah. So we had, I mean, this is something that's near and dear to my heart, and I organized, you know, the two different sessions basically at the symposium. One where we had some of the key academic institutions that have done things collaboratively present from their perspective. And then we had a session where we had practitioners who have collaborated with academics talk about it from their perspective. It's not easy. The industry is not naturally interested in research, to be honest. I mean, I go to TRB, and there are a lot of transit agencies that go, but really not that many compared to the number of transit agencies that are in North America. And you know, those are the ones where they actually are interested in research. So it takes a special effort and maybe luck that brings together, on the one hand, transit agencies that want to move the bar up, that want to become, you know, in best practices, or want to push the envelope, and so they seek out to work to collaborate. But it also takes the academic institutions, like I said, special effort to reach out and to find the formula. And there are different formulas. MIT has used a formula where they sort of took a percentage of capital, huge capital budgets, to have a number of master students work. And it's been very successful. There are many of them, or I know there are a couple on the line, but there's many of them in the industry, and that's worked out very well. Similar, I think TU Delft does something sort of similar to that. Polytechnique has had a good relationship with the transit agencies in the Montreal area. Not quite so formal. There was more what they were able to do was create a chair of mobility that Catherine Morancy has, and there was this group called CIRELT, which is really a combination of very sophisticated analytics and reaching out that Martin Trépanier is involved in. University of South Florida has a long-standing university transportation center programs, and they're relying more on the federal government, the provincial government, sorry, the state government to really do applied research. And they have a number of very practical institutions. They have the National Bus Rapid Transit Institute is there, and they have a National TDM Institute. So there are different formulas, but it really takes an effort on both sides to come to that. I guess I tell my academic friends, before this became a dirty word, but there has to be a quid pro quo. You can't just go to a transit agency and ask, oh, give me all your data and we'll do something interesting with it. It's got to be, there's no such thing as free data. So you have to really come with concepts. Either the transit agency identifies concepts where they know they need more sophisticated data analysis, or the academics come with concepts that would be of interest, that are applied. And that's part of the reason that we organized this day, was to show that a lot of the research that's going on here actually resonates. I think it resonates with real applications that people can see.
Good, thank you. Any more questions before we conclude this segment? Okay, well, thank you so much on behalf of everyone, Brendon. I think we will conclude at this point. Well, there's actually one question. On the supplier side of things, I would agree.
Oh, okay. I always like to be validated. I put out controversial statements that sometimes I feel I've not normally. Sometimes I'm not that kind to suppliers, but I find fault equal on all sides. So it's a multi-layered challenge. So thank you for the comment.